My entire family cut me off because I wouldn't pay for my sister-in-law's dream wedding. My name is Daniel Whitfield, and 3 months ago, my entire family, my parents, my 2 brothers, my aunts, my uncles, even cousins I hadn't spoken to in a decade all stopped talking to me, not on different days, not gradually. Within the span of one single weekend, I went from having a large, loud, complicated family to having almost no one. It wasn't because of a fight over an inheritance. It wasn't because of a secret, or an affair, or something I stole. It happened because of one word. No, I would not hand over $9,000 toward my sister-in-law's $42,000 wedding reception. That's it. That's the whole reason. And by the time I got to the end of this, by the time I sat alone in my new house, scrolling through wedding photos, I had to ask myself a question I never thought I'd need to ask. Was I the villain of my own family story? Or was I the only one who saw clearly what was actually happening? I'm going to tell you everything. The group chat, the dinner where it all fell apart, the sentence my mother said that I don't think I'll ever forget, and what happened months later that made me realize I hadn't lost as much as I thought. Stay with me to the end, because the final twist in this story is something almost nobody expects, including, at the time, me. To understand why this hit as hard as it did, you need to understand my family. I am 34 years old. I grew up in a suburb outside Columbus, Ohio, the middle child of 3 boys. My father, Richard Whitfield, worked 30 years as a supervisor at a manufacturing plant. My mother, Eleanor, stayed home when we were young and later worked part-time at a local elementary school as an administrative assistant. We weren't wealthy. We weren't poor either. We were the kind of family that clipped coupons but still managed at a week vacation every summer, usually to somewhere within driving distance. What defined my family more than money, though, was an unspoken rule: family comes first, no matter what. My mother said it so often growing up that it basically became scripture in our house. Blood takes care of blood. We show up for each other. A family that doesn't sacrifice for each other isn't really a family. For most of my childhood, that rule felt good. It felt like security. When my father was laid off for 8 months during a plant restructuring, my uncle Frank quietly covered part of our mortgage without ever being asked twice. When my grandmother got sick, my mother and her sisters took turns living at the hospital in shifts so she'd never be alone. I grew up believing my family's willingness to sacrifice for each other was one of the best things about us. The problem is that somewhere along the way, we show up for each other quietly, turned into we are entitled to demand things from each other, and nobody in my family seemed to notice the shift happening. I certainly didn't. Not until it happened to me. My oldest brother, Thomas, is 2 years older than me. He became a dentist, has his own practice now, married young to a woman named Karen, and has 2 kids. Thomas was always considered the successful one in family conversations, the one who did everything right. Went to dental school, bought a house in a nice neighborhood by 30. My younger brother, Marcus, is 4 years younger than me. Marcus was always the charismatic one, the one who could talk his way into and out of anything. He works in sales outside sales for an industrial equipment company, and he's genuinely good at it when the market's cooperating. But sales income is inconsistent, and Marcus has never been particularly good at saving during the good months to cushion the bad ones. That's not a judgment, just a fact that becomes relevant later. Me, I landed somewhere in the middle. I went to a state school, studied business, and after a few years bouncing between jobs, found a stable position as a project manager at a logistics company. It's not glamorous work. I coordinate shipping schedules, manage vendor relationships, put out fires when a truck breaks down in Nebraska at 2 in the morning, but it pays well. The benefits are solid. And after 10 years of chipping away at student loans and living below my means, I had finally built up enough savings for a down payment on a house. I want to be really clear about something here, because it matters for everything that happens later. I was not rich. I was not sitting on some huge cushion of disposable income. Every dollar in that savings account represented years of skipped vacations. A car I drove for 11 years past when I probably should have replaced it, and lunches packed from home instead of bought. That money had a purpose. It had my name on it, in every sense. Marcus met Priya about 2.5 years ago, through mutual friends at a work conference. Priya grew up in the UK, in a suburb outside London. Though her family originally came from India, she moved to the United States for graduate school and stayed after landing a good job in pharmaceutical research. She's whip smart, has a dry sense of humor that took me a minute to catch on to. And from the very first family dinner I met her at, she treated my parents with a warmth that honestly seemed to catch my mother off guard. In a good way. I liked Priya immediately. And I want to say clearly, before anything else, nothing in this story is about Priya being a bad person. She wasn't the one who created the situation I am about to describe. If anything, by the end of this story, you'll see she ended up almost as trapped by it as I was. Marcus proposed on a trip to Charleston about 14 months before the wedding. Everyone was thrilled. My mother cried actual tears of joy on the phone with me. I remember that call specifically, because it was such a stark contrast to a phone call we'd have less than a year later. Here's the financial reality nobody said out loud in that early excitement. Marcus and Priya did not have much saved. Marcus, as I mentioned, works commission-based sales, and the 18 months before the engagement had been rough for his industry. A slowdown in industrial orders had cut his income by almost a third for over a year. Priya's income was solid, but she was also sending money home periodically to help her parents, and she'd been in the US long enough to have her own modest savings, but nothing close to wedding fund territory. Priya's parents offered to contribute what they could, but with the exchange rate and their own more modest income back in the UK, their contribution, while generous relative to what they had, wasn't going to stretch far in what my mother had already started calling an American wedding. That phrase should have been a warning sign. My mother had opinions about weddings. Big opinions. She'd been to enough of her friends' children's weddings over the years, country club receptions, $500 centerpieces, one memorable ice sculpture that she had developed, without any of us fully realizing it. A very specific and very expensive idea of what a proper wedding for her son should look like. About 2 months after the engagement, my mother called a family meeting. Not framed as one, she called it getting everyone together to talk about how we can help Marcus and Priya. It sounded generous. It sounded like exactly the kind of family solidarity I'd grown up believing in. I had no idea what I was walking into. The family meeting happened on a Sunday afternoon at my parents' house. Present my parents, Thomas and his wife Karen, Marcus, and me. Priya wasn't there. My mother had specifically arranged it as just the Whitfields, which in hindsight tells you a lot about how this whole plan started. My mother had a folder, an actual physical folder, with printed pages, tabs, a spreadsheet. She'd clearly spent weeks on this. The venue she'd chosen without Marcus or Priya having toured it, I later learned was a banquet hall about 40 minutes outside the city. The kind with a grand staircase and chandeliers that photographed beautifully. The catering package included a full open bar, a plated dinner for 180 guests, a 5-tier custom cake, a live 8-piece band instead of a DJ, a videographer in addition to a photographer. And I remember this detail with total clarity because of what came later. A chocolate fountain rental that alone cost $950. The total, all in, after taxes and gratuities, $40 to $1,300. My mother laid out her plan like she was presenting a business proposal. Thomas, as the eldest and most financially established, would contribute the most, $15,000. I would contribute the second largest amount. Since I make good money and don't have kids to worry about yet, $9,000. My parents would contribute $10,000 from their own retirement savings, a detail that alarmed me even more than my own number, honestly. The remaining $8,000 or so would come from Priya's parents' contribution and whatever Marcus and Priya could scrape together themselves. I sat there for a moment just processing the number. $9,000 was, at that point, almost exactly 1/5 of my entire house down payment fund. Not 1/5 of some abstract extra money, 1/5 of the actual number I needed to hit to qualify for the mortgage I'd been pre-approved for. I asked, as calmly as I could, MOM, did Marcus and Priya ask for this? Do they know these numbers? My mother said, Marcus knows I'm handling it. I wanted to be a surprise for Priya, for both of them, really, to see how much this family loves them. That answer told me everything about how this had actually unfolded. This wasn't Marcus and Priya sitting down, being honest about what they could afford, and asking family for help closing a gap. This was my mother, unilaterally, designing her dream version of her son's wedding, and then distributing the bill among her children like a group. Restaurant check, nobody had agreed to split. I said, I want to help. I really do. But I can't do $9,000 right now. I'm in the middle of saving for a house down payment. And that number would set me back significantly. The room went quiet in that particular way where you can feel everyone recalculating how they see you. My father, who rarely speaks first in these situations, said, "Can you push the house back a bit?" 6 months, a year. By after the wedding, I explained patiently that it doesn't quite work like that I'd been pre-approved based on current rates, that rates were expected to keep climbing, that a specific house I'd already started looking at seriously was realistically going to be gone by the time I'd rebuilt that money, and that pushing back a house purchase isn't like pushing back a dinner reservation. It has real financial consequences, potentially tens of thousands of dollars in higher interest paid over the life of a loan, or losing out on a housing market window entirely. Thomas, to his credit at this stage, said he thought $15,000 was a lot too, but that he and Karen had talked about it and decided they could make it work by dipping into their vacation fund and delaying a kitchen renovation they'd been planning. My mother looked at me and said the first version of a line I would hear many more times over the coming weeks. "So you're saying your house matters more than your brother's wedding?" I told her that wasn't what I was saying at all. I said I was saying that a $42,000 reception wasn't a necessity, and that there were other ways to have a beautiful, meaningful wedding without it costing that much, without it costing me a financial setback that would take years to recover from. That conversation ended without resolution. I left feeling uneasy, but I genuinely believed at that point that reasonable people would eventually see reason. I had no idea how wrong that assumption was. Within a week, I found out, not from my mother directly, but from a family group text, that she had already told the venue coordinator that a deposit was coming. She had already told Priya's parents over an international phone call that the Whitfield side is taking care of everything. My mother had, in effect, committed money that did not yet exist and was not yet agreed to, based entirely on the assumption that once she assigned amounts, we would simply pay them. This is where the pressure campaign really began, and I want to walk through it in some detail, because I think the individual moments matter more than the summary. My Aunt Carol, my mother's younger sister, called me on a Tuesday evening. Carol has always been someone I liked, someone who used to take me and my brothers to the county fair every summer when we were kids. She didn't yell. She used a softer approach, the kind that's honestly harder to push back against. She talked about how fast time goes, how she wished she'd done more for her own kids' weddings, how family memories are the only thing that really matters at the end of a life. She said, "Daniel, you'll never regret giving too much to your brother. You might regret giving too little." I told her I appreciated her perspective, but that a house was not too little, and that I didn't think spending myself into a financial hole for one day was actually generosity. I thought it was something else, something that gets called generosity, but functions more like obligation. My cousin Ben, who I hadn't had a real conversation with in probably for years, sent me a long text message about family loyalty, ending with a line, "I still remember money comes and goes. Family doesn't. Don't let a house make you forget that." I found that message almost funny, in a bleak way, because a house is one of the most literal ways a family builds long-term stability. It's not some frivolous purchase I was choosing over family. But by that point, I was starting to realize that, in my family's narrative, my reasoning didn't matter. What mattered was whether I complied. Even my grandmother, 81 years old, someone who almost never inserts herself into disputes among her grandchildren, left me a voicemail. Her voice was gentle, but the message was clear. She was disappointed and hoped I would reconsider before it's too late to fix things. I want to pause here and say something important. At no point during any of this did anyone ask me detailed questions about my actual financial situation. Nobody asked what my down payment fund represented, how long it took me to save it, what my monthly expenses looked like, or what the real consequence of delaying a home purchase would be for someone in my specific market. The entire conversation operated on the assumption that if I had savings, those savings existed to be redistributed toward whatever the family collectively decided was important, and that questioning that redistribution was itself the moral failure, regardless of what my own plans for that money were. I tried a compromise. I called my mother and told her I could contribute $1,000, which, by any reasonable outside standard, is a generous wedding gift plus my time. I offered to help coordinate vendors, drive out-of-town guests from the airport, handle setup and breakdown at the venue, anything that would save money or labor costs. I even offered to personally negotiate with a couple of vendors, since negotiating contracts is literally part of my job. My mother's response was that $2,000 was an insult given what Thomas was contributing, and that showing up to do labor isn't the same as showing you actually care. That sentence sat with me for a long time. somewhere in my family's logic. Physical help, time, effort, the things I actually had capacity to give generously had been quietly devalued compared to a specific dollar amount that had never been discussed with me before being assigned to me. Around this time, I also had a private conversation with Marcus. I wanted to hear directly from him, not filtered through my mother, what he actually wanted and needed. That conversation was more complicated than I expected. Marcus told me he felt caught in the middle. He admitted that the wedding my mother had planned was bigger than what he and Priya originally wanted. They talked early on about a smaller wedding, maybe 80 guests, a nice restaurant, private room, something in the $15,000 range total. But once my mother got involved, once she started talking to venues and getting excited, Marcus said it felt impossible to scale it back without crushing her. He said, almost pleadingly, "Can't you just find a way to make the $9,000 work?" For me, that question for me is one I've thought about a lot since, because I don't think Marcus was being malicious. I think Marcus, more than anyone else in this story, was simply the person with the least power in a situation our mother had constructed and then handed to the rest of us to fund. But at the time, hearing my own brother ask me to sacrifice my financial future for him, when he himself hadn't set the number and privately thought it was too high, felt like a kind of abandonment. He wasn't willing to push back against our mother on his own behalf, but he was willing to let me absorb the consequences of not pushing back. I told him I loved him, that I wanted his wedding day to be wonderful, and that I would help in every way except handing over $9,000. I didn't have room to give. He didn't respond well. He said quietly, "I guess I know where I stand with you then," and ended the call. The breaking point came 3 weeks before the wedding, at what was supposed to be a final planning dinner at my parents' house. I almost didn't go. Something in me knew what was coming, but I told myself that avoiding it wouldn't fix anything, and that maybe, face to face, with everyone at the same table, we could actually resolve this like adults. I want to walk you through this dinner in detail, because it's the moment everything shifted permanently. I arrived to find the whole extended crew there, my parents, Thomas and Karen, Marcus, and even my Aunt Carol, which I hadn't expected. Priya wasn't there again, which in hindsight I think was deliberate. I believe my mother wanted this conversation to happen without Priya present. Possibly so. Priya could remain unaware of exactly how contentious the funding had become. We made it through maybe 15 minutes of normal conversation before my mother brought up the venue deposit deadline, which was in for days. She said, looking directly at me, "So I need to know today, are you in for the 9,000 or not?" I said, "MOM, I already told you, I can do 2,000, plus my time. That offer still stands." My father spoke up this time, more directly than before. He said, "Daniel, we're not asking you to bankrupt yourself. We're asking you to prioritize. Everybody has to make sacrifices for family sometimes." I said, "I am prioritizing. I'm prioritizing 10 years of saving and the first real financial security I've ever had. I don't think that makes me selfish. I think it makes me responsible." My mother slammed her hand flat on the table, not violently, but hard enough that the silverware rattled. She said, "This isn't about being responsible, Daniel. This is about you thinking you're better than this family. You always have. Ever since you moved out, you've acted like the rest of us are beneath you." That accusation stunned me, because it had nothing to do with anything I'd said. I hadn't claimed superiority. I'd stated a financial boundary. But in that moment, I understood that this conversation had stopped being about the wedding budget at all. It had become about whether I would submit to the family's authority over my own resources, and my refusal was being reframed in real time as a referendum on my character. Then Marcus spoke, and this is the part that still, months later, is the hardest for me to think about. He looked at me across the table and said, "I never thought my own brother would make my wedding about money." I said, "Marcus, I'm not the one who set a $42,000 budget. I'm not the one who booked a venue before asking anyone if they could afford it. I offered $2,000 and my time. That's not making it about money. That's you all deciding my contribution had to be a specific number or it didn't count." He said, "You could find the money if you actually wanted to. You just don't want to." That sentence, "you just don't want to," was, in some ways, the most painful thing said that whole night, because it dismissed everything true about my situation. It wasn't that I lacked the desire to help my brother. It was that finding the money meant either draining a savings account I'd spent a decade building, or going into debt for someone else's chocolate fountain. I tried, one more time, to explain the actual numbers. I told them exactly what my down payment fund represented: 10 years of saving, a specific house, I had already made an offer on contingent on my financing coming through on schedule. A mortgage pre-approval with an expiration date. Current interest rates that were higher than they'd been a year earlier. I laid it all out, calmly, factually. My mother cut me off. She said, "I don't want to hear about interest rates at my son's wedding dinner." And then she said the sentence that ended things. The one I don't think I will ever fully stop hearing in my head. When I think about that year, if you can't show up for this family when it matters, don't expect this family to show up for you. I sat there for a second in total silence. Then I said, quietly, okay. I finished my glass of water, thanked my father for having me, and I left. Nobody stopped me. Nobody followed me to the car. The days that followed were disorienting in a way I don't think I can fully explain. Unless you've experienced something similar, it wasn't one dramatic cutoff. It was a series of small, cold erasures. Within 4 days, I noticed I'd been removed from the family group chat, the one we used for everything from holiday planning to sharing photos of my niece and nephew. Nobody announced it. I simply stopped receiving messages. And when I texted my mother directly asking if something was wrong with the group chat, she didn't respond for 3 days, and then only replied, "I think it's better this way for now." My Aunt Carol unfollowed me on social media. My cousin Ben sent me exactly one text in the following weeks. Hope the house was worth it. I didn't respond. The wedding itself happened on schedule. I want to be honest, I wasn't formally uninvited, in the sense that no one ever called me and said the words "you're not welcome." What happened was quieter, and in some ways worse. The final headcount for catering was due to the venue 2 weeks before the wedding. I never received a follow-up call to confirm attendance, never got a seating chart question, never got a +1 inquiry. I found out I'd effectively been dropped from the guest list when my cousin's wife posted photos from the reception on social media, and I realized, scrolling through smiling faces at candlelit tables, that I recognized every single person in every photo except myself. I won't pretend that didn't hurt. It hurt in a way that's hard to fully put into words. The specific ache of realizing your absence from a family event wasn't even worth a phone call to explain. For the first several weeks after the wedding, the silence from my family was almost total. My mother didn't call. My father didn't call. Marcus, obviously, was on his honeymoon and then settling into married life, and I heard nothing from him either. I closed on the house during that same stretch of silence. I remember sitting in the empty living room the night I got the keys, boxes still unpacked, and feeling an emotion I couldn't fully name, something between pride and grief. I had done exactly what I'd worked 10 years to be able to do, and the people I most wanted to share that moment with weren't speaking to me. Here is the part of this story that I think matters most, because it's the part that changed how I understood everything that had happened. About 2 months after the wedding, Thomas texted me. Not a big emotional message, just a simple "Hey, you around this weekend? Want to grab lunch?" We hadn't spoken since before the dinner. I said yes, mostly out of curiosity. Over lunch, Thomas told me something I hadn't expected. He admitted that paying his $15,000 had strained his and Karen's finances more than he'd anticipated. Between the wedding contribution and delaying their kitchen renovation, they'd ended up dipping into an emergency fund they'd always kept untouched, and it had caused real tension between him and Karen that spring. He told me quietly, "I probably should have backed you up more at that dinner. I agreed with a lot of what you said. I just didn't want to be the second person against MOM in the same night." That admission didn't undo anything, but it did something important. It confirmed that my read on the situation hadn't been some isolated, selfish overreaction. Thomas, the brother who'd actually paid, had privately thought the number was unreasonable the entire time. He'd just made a different calculation about which discomfort he was willing to absorb. A few weeks after that, my father called me. This surprised me more than almost anything else in this whole story, because my father almost never initiates phone calls. That had always been my mother's role in the family. He didn't say much at first, just asked how the house was coming along, whether the furnace was holding up, normal small talk. Then, almost as an aside, he said, "Your mother went a little overboard with all of this, Daniel. I think somewhere in there, she knows it too. She's just not the kind of person who says that kind of thing out loud." I asked him directly, did he think I'd been wrong to say no? He was quiet for a moment, and then he said something I've turned over in my head many times since. He said, "I think you were the only one of us willing to say a true thing at an inconvenient time. That's not usually what gets rewarded in this family. Maybe it should be." The most unexpected contact, though, came from Priya in the spring. several months after the wedding. She reached out with a simple message asking if I'd be willing to meet for coffee, just the two of us. I said yes, though I'll admit I was nervous. I didn't know what to expect, and part of me worried she might have absorbed the family's narrative that I was the villain in all this. Instead, what she told me changed my understanding of the entire situation. She told me that she'd felt deeply uncomfortable throughout the whole planning process, watching the pressure build on me specifically, and that she'd actually asked Marcus more than once to scale things back to have the smaller wedding they'd originally talked about. She said Marcus had told her it was already too far along to change course. Once his mother had committed to the venue and vendors, she said she'd felt swept along by a wedding that had, in a real sense, stopped being hers and Marcus's and become my mother's production. And then she told me the part that has stayed with me the most, that she and Marcus were now dealing with real financial strain in the first year of their marriage, between the money they'd personally put in, some wedding-related costs that ran over budget, and a difficult stretch in Marcus's sales income that had continued into the new year. They were carrying debt neither of them had expected to start their marriage with. She said, gently, without any resentment in her voice, I understand why you said no. I actually wish more people had. I didn't say I told you so. That's not who I want to be in this story. But I won't pretend it didn't validate something. I'd spent months second-guessing. As for my mother and me, we're still not close. Not in the way we used to be. We speak occasionally now, carefully. The way two people navigate a room. They both know still has broken glass somewhere on the floor. She hasn't apologized. Not directly. Not in so many words. But last month, she sent me a text with a photo from a home decor magazine, an idea for curtains. She said, that would look nice in my new place. It wasn't an apology, but it was, I think, an attempt at a bridge. I sent back a simple thanks, I'll look into it, and left it there. Some relationships, I've learned, don't get resolved in one dramatic conversation. They get slowly, imperfectly, rebuilt, or they don't. And you have to make peace with that too. Looking back on everything now, months removed from that dinner table, I don't regret my decision. I bought the home I'd worked 10 years to be able to afford. I didn't go into debt funding a reception I wasn't consulted on, for a wedding that ended up straining the very marriage it was supposed to celebrate. But I also don't think this story has a clean villain, even though it probably felt that way at different points. If you were listening from different family members' perspectives, I think my mother genuinely believed she was expressing love the only way she knew how, through grand gestures, through spending, through orchestrating a beautiful day. I think Marcus was caught between people he loved and didn't know how to protect his own boundaries, let alone mine. I think even the family members who pressured me were, in their own way, just repeating a family script none of us had ever examined closely. The idea that love is measured in sacrifice, and sacrifice is measured in dollars. What I learned the hard way is that family comes first is a beautiful idea until someone uses it to justify demanding things from you without ever actually asking. There's a real difference between generosity freely given and obligation dressed up as love. I gave what I could genuinely afford, money and time both, and for that I lost, for a while, almost everyone. But I also gained something. I gained the clarity of knowing exactly which relationships in my life could survive me having a boundary, and which ones couldn't. Thomas and my father are slowly becoming closer to me than they ever were before all this happened, maybe because this whole situation forced an honesty between us that had never existed before. Priya, unexpectedly, has become someone I trust and talk to more than I ever imagined I would. So, I'll leave you with the question I still ask myself sometimes, late at night, in the house that cost me $9,000 I didn't spend, and for a while, almost my entire family. Was I wrong? I don't think I was, but I genuinely love to know what you think. If this story meant something to you, tell me in the comments below. I read every single one, and some of the most interesting conversations on this channel happen down there. And if you want more real stories like this one, hit subscribe, because there are a lot more where this came from. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next one.